let's get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Hiring. Your questions answered. Before we get started, I just want to go through a few housekeeping items. We set up this webinar to allow anonymous audience questions, so feel free to ask about anything that comes up during our discussion. Also, during this panel, we'll allow time for questions relevant to the topic being discussed after panelists have responded to a moderator question. We'll also answer questions about this discussion, sort of general questions at the end during our 15-minute Q&A. And just the last thing I want to say is this webinar is being recorded. We'll email you a link tomorrow, and you can play it back in case you miss anything. So discussions about DEI are taking place everywhere, from internal corporate communications to professional groups and conferences. I myself attended 3 DEI webinars within the last month. They've all been wonderful, informative, and insightful, and it's amazing to see so much dedication to having these necessary discussions. All right. So, making sure our workplaces are equitable, diverse, and inclusive is key to our success as a society, but there's also a business case for doing so. A 2020 study from McKinsey & Company of 1,000 public businesses in 15 countries found that companies that invested in DEI performed better financially than those who didn't. Businesses were grouped into quartiles, ranging from those who had the least amount of investment to those deemed diversity leaders. In 2019, companies leading the charge in increasing diversity outperformed those in the 4th quartile, also named the laggard group, by 36% in terms of profitability. And there is a slide, so here in this slide, you can see similar results for companies who are working to improve gender diversity. It's clear that investment in DEI is no longer a nice to have, but a must have for continued growth and success. One way to ensure your company is moving forward is to build diverse teams. Today, we'll discuss exactly that. It's my absolute privilege to introduce you to the panelists today for this topic. We have Carmen Phelps, the lead DEI and racial equity consultant at Project 986 Consulting, the amazing Toni Bowie, founder of MaxLife LLC, and the executive director of Justice Jobs of Maryland, Bob Clegg. Now, I want to give them time to tell you a little bit about themselves. So let's start with you, Carmen.
Absolutely. Jason, thank you so much for that opening. And no, really, really excited to be here with Toni and Bob, great advocates for this work, great influencers when it comes to this topic, and just really excited to be here. I have served as a DEI consultant, partnering with organizations, agencies, community initiatives for a number of years throughout my career. And I'm really excited that there is so much discussion on this important, challenging, but also inspired topic of conversation. So again, grateful for the chance to contribute to answer questions, and looking forward to working with Toni and Bob on this.
Very exciting. All right, Toni, how about you? Let's hear a little bit about yourself.
Okay, and first let me say it is also to me an honor to be here with you all. I sincerely appreciate the invitation and just hope to be able to add to the conversation with Dr. Carmen and Bob and you all as well. I have been working in the D&I space for a little over 30 years. I kind of shudder when I think about that, but a little over 30 years. And I have the opportunity to lead through MaxLife a team of diversity, equity, and inclusion strategists. So we go into other organizations, and no matter where you are on that scale, we help to propel you forward. So thank you again for allowing me to be here.
Oh, thank you we're so happy to have you with us. Bob, could you let folks know who you are and tell us a little bit about the work that you do at Justice Jobs of Maryland?
Sure, Jason. Thank you so much for that introduction. I guess I go all the way back to about 35 years ago in my Justice Job story, although I haven't been doing this work for nearly that long. In my early 20s, I was homeless for 3 or 4 years, and I thought I called myself a hobo, but someone told me later on, no, Bob, you were homeless. That's what we call it. And At the end of that time, at about 25 or 26 years old, I came back east. Someone helped me get a job as a night watchman. That led to retraining as a respiratory therapist, and then that led back into college and graduate school, and I became a chemist for about 20 years. And about 5 years ago, I was tired of working with little bitty doodads, and with the blessing of my wife and her financial support, went back to school and went to seminary. And that's where, as a privileged white male, I really became aware of DEI work, and volunteered at a job at a free unemployment office in Washington, D.C. called Jubilee Jobs. And just realized one day, wow, I could do this. And so for 3 years, we have had a free jobs office in Frederick. We're called Justice Jobs of Maryland. And we help people get jobs, keep jobs, and move up to better jobs, especially people who have barriers to employment. And those barriers can be anything from the effects of racism, ageism, genderism, sexism, ableism, to recent or long ago incarceration, substance use disorder, and even transportation and childcare difficulties. These are all barriers to employment that hiring people unwittingly discriminate against all the time. And so that's what we're working on. And I want to thank iHire as well for their support of Justice Jobs. iHire has contributed financially in a significant way to our cause. And we're really grateful for that.
Yeah, we definitely align with the work that you do. So thank you so much. And I just want to say I'm honored to have you all here. This is very exciting. So yeah, watch me be a fanboy for a few minutes.
That's all good. We appreciate that.
All right, so let's jump into it. So for our first question, over the last few years, many companies have started implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion guidelines. So big names include Johnson & Johnson, Kaiser Permanente, and Cisco Systems. But we're also seeing an equal amount of effort from small companies and emerging startups. So I just want to ask the panel, which companies, if any, do you think have done it well, and what makes them stand out? And this is jump right in if you have a comment here.
Okay. I'll go behind you, Jason. And you mentioned some of the larger ones. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to add one more to that large list, and that's General Motors. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons why I say General Motors, if you go to their website, you can really get an idea of their full expectations that they have of their workforce in participating in these change efforts. And even more important to that, they have specific policies that they are enacting. And having policies is very key to what this whole conversation is about. And of course, there are some smaller organizations. There are organizations that this is very new to, and they are making that commitment. And I just appreciate all of those organizations as well. I will mention just one of the smaller ones, the City of Frederick. The City of Frederick, where I currently live, is doing a remarkable job. I'm a little biased in that opinion too. I'll just say that, okay?
Well, I live here too, so I support that statement.
Yeah, Toni, thank you so much for offering that up. And actually in your response, I feel a lot less pressure here to be specific in naming particular companies that are, implementing DEI guidelines and doing it well. I mean, it's probably one of the top 5 most common questions I get in this work as a DEI racial equity consultant. It's probably, like among the first 3 for sure is, potential clients want to know who's doing it well. And for me, I'm not so sure that is the best or most productive question. For me, in this work, I find that what is most important is to encourage perspective potential and current clients to think about what they can do, no matter what other companies, no matter what other organizations or even government agencies are doing in the space of work. The question really comes down to how can your organization be an engine for prosperity, justice, equity, inclusion, diversity, et cetera, for all people, for all races, right? Abilities, right? Identities, et cetera. So, there's so many different entry points with respect to what folks can do better and do more of to enhance their capacity to recruit, hire, diverse talent out there. There's so many entry points. The point is just to start doing it. Is just to start thinking about where you can create greater access to your, positions, your open opportunities, where you can build relationships to really sort of, tap into, cultures, who may not have had, again, access to those opportunities, where you can start thinking about all of the processes that are put in place in your organization. And even to your point, Toni, policies which are being implemented, which could be getting in the way of your potential to do more and do better in these areas. So, while I always appreciate, because I know it's one particular way of speaking the language of DEI, I always appreciate when folks want to make the business case, right, for DEI. I think that's super important. And as Jason just shared with us on that slide, there's so much data out there that talks about and backs up the importance of this work from a business standpoint. But we're also seeing a huge shift in the way this conversation is being had with respect to that business case. So now more and more companies, organizations, agencies, et cetera, programs are thinking about this from the moral standpoint of things as well. So again, I just, sort of appreciate the question about which companies, but I think the more important question is, what can we do as an organization for sure?
Yeah. I'm going to hear that. And, I think a couple of points there. I mean, this is a conversation for all of us, right? It's nice to have a model. It's nice to have somebody to look towards. It's also important to build out in your own unique way what, fits your business model the best. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We do have one question from the audience. How can small businesses with limited resources and staff incorporate more inclusive hiring practices? I think Carmen, you touched on that a little bit.
Yeah.
I
something that comes to mind for me here, and I'd be curious to know what Toni and Bob think about this, given the nature of the work that they do as well and their experiences with it. But I recently did kind of an interactive training on this subject for a small group of small business owners and entrepreneurs. So, they are, not large companies or corporations, just a handful of staff, for instance. And one of the things I was encouraging of that group of small business owners and entrepreneurs was to start to build a community of practice when it comes to DEI. With other small business owners, right? So that you all are working together, sharing resources, sharing knowledge, sharing strategies, supporting one another in your efforts to want to do more and do better in this space when you don't have like larger teams of folks to dedicate time and resources to some of this work. So that's one way of thinking about it, sort of organizing or coordinating, if you will, with other small business owners and other folks representing smaller businesses. To build, again, a community where you're supporting one another's goals and sharing that information. So that's one thing you could think about.
Yeah, that's an excellent idea.
And I'm going to come right behind Dr. Carmen and even just add to what she's been saying, because one of the things that we have been doing also in MaxLife is we work with very small organizations. And say, for example, we might have a training. That might be one of the things that we're doing with an organization. Well, sometimes that can be a little costly for the smaller organization, but there are a certain number of seats that they can fill. So building those relationships with other small organizations just to collaborate, come in and help to fill those seats, that helps not just them, but that other organization as well. So it is critically important not to just think about whether you have the resources yourself, but to think a little bit outside of that box and who can support you in this. So don't let that stop you.
Absolutely.
I hear what Carmen is saying, and I second that wholeheartedly. If that's worth anything, Carmen, it's just a matter of, and it's not as simple as just do it. That would be like, I heard on the news this morning, some county had come into a whole pile of money from the recent act, and the commission was voting on whether or not to spend it before they had a plan. And that doesn't sound like it makes good sense to me. You always need a budget. And the same thing for something like DEI. You need to have a plan. You need to have some things written down and learned about and discussed about. But at Justice Jobs, I'm sad to say that I can't speak with authority about actual DEI guidelines that companies have, because we haven't questioned employer partners of Justice Jobs about that. And we need to start doing that. But I can tell you, employers who are inclusive in practice and where we can turn to get people with really high barriers to employment to help them get on. And it's places like what Toni was talking about the city, I think, and Frederick County Public Schools is another wonderful example of a very inclusive employer. Surprisingly, for a big box store, Lowe's has every store has its own HR person for that store. You don't have to call Kansas City and get an applicant approved before the hiring manager can even look at their application. And a lot of people get in at Lowe's who, for a ground floor job, who can't get in at a lot of other places. Giant Food, Flying Dog Brewery, a lot of the smaller, more youth-owned companies are doing this, I think, from a moral perspective, as someone said. I hire in that regard. And another not so much employer, but another assistance job search assistance place locally that I know is doing it, and they're doing it more from a DEI perspective because they're a function of the county and an organ of the state. It's Frederick County Workforce Services. They're totally fair about the services that they provide. That's where I would. Those are some examples, I think, of local places that we've had good practical experience with.
I like this idea of breaking out of our silos, our offices, and really taking a community approach. I think that's really a smart way to handle it. So just in the interest of time, I think that we have another question, but I'm going to save it until the end. And I'll jump on to the next moderated question. So an overarching goal of addressing bias and subjectivity in the interview process is to ensure that every candidate's experience is the same. So what steps can hiring managers take to achieve that goal? And maybe same isn't the best approach. I mean,
yeah. Right. Again, such an important question. And I know this is something I've been talking with folks at iHire about too, right? And I know we're continuing our work together in this area. So one thing to think about with respect to addressing bias and really sort of thinking about, what it means for every candidate's experience to be the same, right? So that is really the important piece there, making sure every candidate's experience is the same. But that's also right, but to apply that DEI lens, right, so to speak, in terms of addressing bias, that also means, right, that you have to be intentional about addressing, the invariable, likely, right, ways where bias is impacting your recruitment and hiring processes, right? So, even as you work to ensure that you're being consistent in terms of, the kinds of questions that you're asking for every person being interviewed, in terms of how, your interviewers are showing up, to do their jobs in those roles, in terms of how you're engaging with candidates, communicating with candidates, what is happening even interpersonally, whether that's in person or face-to-face or even via Zoom. Like, it's very important to ensure as much as possible that you're not being robotic or mechanical about that, right? But that you're intentionally being consistent in those efforts. But that does not mean sort of, I guess, like, what comes to mind for me is it's something sort of analogous to being colorblind, which is not something we want to be. We don't want to be colorblind in our processes. We want to make sure that we are conscientious of the challenges that people of color face when it comes to job search processes, for instance, women, other members of marginalized groups, for instance. So we have to be conscientious of those experiences if we want to work with intention to make sure that they have equitable access to job opportunities, and also that they are treated equally, fairly, and with respect, compared to their, white counterparts, for instance, if we're talking about folks of color. So consistency is important. Making sure that, those interview experiences are consistent, making sure that your questions, the questions that you're asking of every candidate, right? Making sure those questions are as, free from bias as you can get them, so that there are no assumptions being made, in the nature of the questions being asked, but they're general, open enough, right? To where, any candidate can access those questions. All those things are really, really important. So it can start with the training, right? What does it mean to address bias in hiring and recruitment, for instance? But, the other piece of that is just to make sure that you're having those internal conversations, recruitment, hiring teams, for instance. I always say, anyone who touches your hiring recruitment processes, making sure that you're all having conversations about the outcomes of your review processes, so that you're, talking through where could you all be, potentially susceptible to bias, and how you're thinking about every single candidate. So I'd say all those things are important.
And I'm going to come behind you, Carmen, and just add a little piece to that. I think this is such a critical question. And I think it's critical for a number of reasons, but I want us to think about this too. When we talk about DEI, we're actually talking very largely about a change process. And one of the first opportunities that an organization has for change is who they bring into the doors. It's so much easier to bring in people who have the knowledge, skills, and abilities that you're looking for, rather than try to switch and change other people, because that's not what you really want to do anyway. So coming into the situation, into the hiring, is so critically important for organizations to really put consistent effort into. That's just the easiest way to do it.
Yeah.
And when it comes to people who touch the hiring process, one of the most important things is self-awareness. And we often talk about implicit bias or unconscious bias. That is absolutely a critical piece to this. But don't forget also conscious bias. Things that we are actually aware of. We very often leave that out of the conversation. And there are so many different ways that bias touches the hiring process. And it touches the hiring process because bias touches people. So one of my little trick questions is this: who has biases? Everybody, that's the answer. Everybody has biases. So it's critically important for us to become aware of our biases, mitigate the biases that we want to, understand the source of those biases, do some changing there if we want to, if we choose to. But very important, understand also how our biases impact other people, because they do impact other people. And sometimes people will think, oh, they impact them in a positive way, or of course, in a not so positive way. But however it impacts people, always ask this question. Also, how fair is it? How fair is it to this person or to this person? So again, I think it is such an important question. I think everyone who touches the hiring process must be in conversation about biases, understand those biases. And there's a whole list actually of some of the more common biases when it comes to the hiring process, but just be critically aware.
I would. I just want to say that that really, to begin with, I'm really privileged to be on this call with Toni and Carmen. From where I sit, my eyes have been opened in the last 5 years, last 6 or 7 years. When I went to seminary, I was largely unaware of many of the things that y'all are talking about here. And one of the watershed moments in my life was when I walked into a class where we had been assigned to do a genealogy. And I walked in with my paper rolled up, and it was about a 3-foot high piece of paper that was 6 feet wide. So I had it rolled up, and the fellow sitting behind me said, "What's that?" And I said, "Well, that's my genealogy that I looked up online." And he pointed to his 8x11 piece of paper on his desk and said, "I wish I knew my great grandfather's name." And he was Black. And I was like, holy cow, what privilege I have to be able to look up my genealogy like this online. And I just kind of hid my little roll under my chair and didn't mention it for the rest of for the whole class period. Understanding, as Toni was talking about, you're talking about the importance of understanding. It's the beginning of compassion. That white people, men, people, we all dominant groups need to understand in some way. Need to focus and understand and become aware in order to have compassion. The one clear thing that I could say to this question would be about what steps can hiring managers take. It's really more of a company thing. The hiring managers need to be taught to interview. They need to be given clear selection criteria. And especially in our experience, fair and relevant background check criteria. One of the biggest problems we face is inconsistencies in background check criteria. And I see the differences between how Black people are responded to and white people are responded to when we send people to the same companies with the same records. That happens in Frederick, Maryland, and we need to get over it and recognize that and figure out as company owners and company leaders how we're going to train hiring managers to implement fair and relevant background check criteria so that people of color who have been adversely affected, unfairly affected through mass incarceration, don't continue to be affected that way for the rest of their lives. Instead, we need to focus on the relevant skills and competencies and get over our predispositions about what a record of incarceration might mean. Because for the last 40 years, I better shut up.
No, it's great.
For the last 40 years, that's been building, and that's our generational baggage, our generational legacy that my generation is just about phasing out on. But the next generation coming on, the millennials and the Gen Xers, they're the ones who've got to outgrow that generation and not let the sins of the parents pass down to the third and the fourth generation.
I so appreciate what Bob has just said. And I also appreciate how Bob keeps saying that he's honored to be here on this panel with Toni and Carmen. So I'm going to back that up, if I can, Bob, just for a moment, and say how grateful we are, and I'm going to speak for you, Carmen, if that's okay.
Please do.
How grateful we are to be on a panel with you. So let me just say something about you, if I can.
Please do.
It is so critically important to have people who look like you, white men, in this conversation, white men who really understand the root of this conversation. white males, let's just face it, let's just be real, lead many of the organizations here in this country.
Mhm.
And so in order to impact, in order to affect change, we need you as part of this conversation. So thank you for being here. We need you, okay? So we're just as honored to be here with you. I want to say this about what you just said as well. Having clear criteria is critically important. One of the things we've just done with a client is almost restructured a large part of their hiring process. And that includes even from resume selection all the way to justifying who is being hired and also who is not being hired. It adds a level of accountability. You know, so often when it comes to the hiring process, we would hear things like, do they fit the culture of the organization? Are they a good fit? And I see your head going back, Bob. Makes you go back every time, doesn't it? Makes you go back every time. We have to get away from that. And we have to be more equitable, as Dr. Carmen had mentioned earlier. And Carmen, you know, I keep saying Dr. Carmen.
Yes.
I'm doing that very purposely, okay?
Yes.
But until we get to a point, and I have no idea when that's going to be, when this is a natural occurrence, we have to be extremely specific and know that this is not going to happen organically. If it were going to happen organically, it would have happened already. So we've got to have those specific, clear criteria absolutely in place.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, Toni, Bob, I second, third, everything you've shared so far, and just so grateful to the two of you for being able to, in a session that's so important like this, for encouraging those of us wanting to do better in this space of work, those of us really wanting to work with intention to promote, prioritize DEI, to encourage folks to be explicit in those intentions, but also honest and authentic, right, about the challenges associated with doing this work. You know, Bob, like in disclosing some of the things you just disclosed about your own journey, you know, to awareness and understanding about the issues, you know, regarding white privilege, for instance, right? White dominant culture, for instance, right? Those are things that you named, ways in which you know you are connected to the challenges associated with this work. But also, right, because we're all implicated and connected, right, we all have the potential and the capacity to influence and inspire in favor of change, right, in favor of DEI. So just really appreciating, like, it's, you know, through those personal narratives and those personal experiences that we're sharing associated with this work, I think, you know, change is most, you know, likely to happen. And also too, Toni, for your reference earlier to not the unconscious, you know, bias, but the conscious bias. And you're so right, Toni. It's, you know, there's such a fear, you know, of folks, right, in engaging in discussions around the conscious bias, for instance, and the macroaggressions, right, not the micro, but the macroaggressions, for instance. And those are things we also need to talk about openly and candidly, right? So just for folks to know joining this call that, you know, just really, you know, that sort of honest self-reflection and honest engagement of the issues and the questions, though that's the foundation, right, for all of this work to happen. So yeah, just really appreciating those comments.
I'm still trying to catch my breath here because that was a lot. That was really great. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to jump to the next question, so I can have some time we'll have some time for Q&A here at the end. All right, let's see. So, question 3, many companies are using tools like gender decoders, blind hiring, and diverse interview panels to reduce bias. These are big investments into improving company culture, but not a lot of focus has been placed on screening candidates about their views on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Should interviews include these questions, and what are some examples you would use in real life to try to ensure an inclusive work culture?
I'll kind of go back to what I said previously, that when you're bringing new hires in, that's the first opportunity to impact change within your organization. So I would absolutely agree that asking questions about a candidate's view on DEI is necessary. And even before they become a candidate, an organization might even include that in the application process. And you might include it in the application process. You want your prospective employees to understand where you are when it comes to DEI. Having questions like that, even in that application process, will absolutely let them know. And there are specific questions that you can ask. And I see here, or heard here that you asked if we could even give one or two specific questions. So one of the things I actually just did with a client is just this, developed a list. And, excuse me, here's the thing that also happens with that list. You have people who are in the hiring process who have different levels of understanding. So we've always got to keep that in mind as well. But asking questions, well, first, here's just one very basic question. And we might start out like this. Diversity is about characteristics that make people different from one another. And so why do we start it like this? Everybody doesn't really understand, perhaps, what diversity is, what inclusion is, certainly not what equity is. So then you give them just a little bit of an introduction. So again, diversity is about characteristics that make people different from one another. Can you talk about your experience working with people who you consider different from you? That's just a very, very basic question, but it can also let the hiring managers and the hiring panel know a lot more about that candidate. And there's a whole list that you could just ask. Yes. So that was just one. So I'll give that one.
Oh, wow. Toni, that's such a great question and such an interesting and really important, effective approach to this kind of question. And by the way, you're going to have to share that list of questions. I'm so curious to know like what they are. And I think, honestly, right. I mean, just going back to the earlier points that Bob and Toni were making, I mean, you really should be asking questions like these as early as, in the application process, like, potential prospective applicants should know that you are pursuing, this kind of information. There's lots of different ways to make them aware of the fact that if this is true, the fact that your organization prioritizes DEI, in its practices internally, externally, et cetera. And I also appreciate one of the things that Toni, mentioned was, sort of, including kind of like a definition for what we're talking about with respect to DEI or, on the most basic level, diversity, because I can't tell you how often folks will respond to a question around diversity by first saying, oh, diversity of thought is so important. Having a diverse, workforce, people whom think differently about different things, and not to trivialize the importance of that, of course, right? I mean, I don't know how that couldn't necessarily happen. We're all unique individuals, human beings, but, really what we're talking about specifically with respect to DEI, we're talking about, diverse, identities, cultures, populations of people, inclusive of our most underserved, marginalized, historically underrepresented groups of folks, right? So really important to be clear with folks what you mean when you reference DEI. And also, just to be thinking about acquiring information like, through a question, having to do with like a candidate's or an applicant's experiences, supporting DEI initiatives, in their, professional life, or, what kinds of experiences, could they talk about or share? What were some of the learning outcomes, associated with those experiences, et cetera. So, again, going back to the original, one of the earlier points, at least that Toni was making, right? A lot of this is about your organization's culture. And so, you want to encourage a culture, a workforce, where folks are supporting your DEI initiatives, actively participating, contributing, held accountable, right? To go back to some of the things Bob was talking about before. And one of the ways in which to ensure that as much as you possibly can is to be, hiring folks whom are going to be supportive of those objectives, right? So it's absolutely important to be asking some question that gets to a candidate's experiences supporting or participating in this work.
One of the, this really goes back to one of the skills or habits that we try to train job seekers at Justice Jobs to exercise in job interviews, and that's to answer questions with a short story, 15 to 45-second story. That not just to, your interview is not going to last very long if you answer yes or no to every question. And as interviewers, I think one of the things you want to do is give them room to do that and to have themselves be shown the door. But if you're considering this person, you really want to know more than a yes or no answer to the question whether they're being diverse and inclusive. So you can ask questions that prompt stories, and even it doesn't have to be a professional interview where you might ask about values or ask about diversity as such. Certainly, I think you can go there, as has been suggested here, by describing what diversity is, and then going there in a more entry-level interview. But no matter which type you are, a great question is, tell me about a time when you made sure everybody was included. When you saw somebody being left out, tell me about that. If you're really looking to have a diverse, equitable environment and a diverse team, do you want somebody on there who can't think of a time when they ever stood up for somebody? Tell me about a time when you've demonstrated a commitment to diversity. And especially in more professional training, but more and more in entry-level jobs, what diversity and inclusion and cultural competence training have you had? Have you ever had that? If the answer is no, would you be open to having that? Well, how receptive would you be to that? Do you think that's important? And why? To the life of our company, to the value of our company. And this gets over into Heather McGee's recent book, which everybody who's listening to this call should, I'll tell you what you should read, right? But you should read it. It'll blow your mind. It's in the language of business, which means dollars and cents, what racism is doing to our prosperity in a negative way.
Yeah.
So I'd like to add another piece to this question, and it might even be combining the previous question. But hiring managers and everyone who touches the hiring process, they have so much influence and impact on an individual's life. They literally impact perhaps generations. So we live here in the DMV, and there are some certain freeways, highways that we know very well that we don't want to be on early in the morning. 270 might be one of them. 495 might be one of them. One of the things that historically has happened is that people have not been able to find fair employment close to where they live. And so they have to hit the highway. And I want hiring managers to understand how that impacts not just an individual, but also a family. Think about the mother who has to spend 3, perhaps 4 hours a day on the road getting to and from work and does not have that time to put into her children, or the father who can't give it to his children. That impacts generations. And all just because they could not find fair employment sometimes closer to where they live. So this is really a big issue. And I just want us to just know that and concentrate on that as well.
Toni, if I could just very briefly riff off of that, something that our county transportation system needs to be called out on here is the inability of people who are poor to get to jobs on Sundays. The buses don't run in Frederick County on Sundays. Now, I had no idea of that until I started doing this a few years ago. It's like, what? They don't run on Sundays? How are you going to get an entry-level job where you're expected to be there Saturday and Sunday to cover the shifts that nobody else wants because you haven't worked your way up to those shifts when you can't get to work on Sunday? It's a huge barrier to employment, and it's put in place by, it's a subsidized bus system. You see buses riding up and down Market Street all day long with nobody on them. And it's subsidized. Why can't we subsidize it for one more day so that those people can get to work?
Yeah, and Frederick's not alone. I've seen this all across the country.
Yes.
Sometimes on Saturdays, no buses are available.
You're right. Not to be especially critical of Frederick, but yeah, we need to make Frederick the exception, the positive exception here, not the rule.
Right. So I just have. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm so sorry. I was just going to say, that's one of the reasons why, that's another letter, to add to DEI, which is A for access, right? Because so much of what we're talking about, right, has to do with lack of access to resources or opportunity, for instance. And that's the example that Bob just lifted up there is such an important one. Yeah. Yeah,
definitely. So I know we're getting close to time, so I just want to ask one last question. If there was only one thing that you'd want hiring managers to take away from this panel, what would it be? I know we've covered a lot, but if you have one more thing.
I would just say, you have to take the time to invest in understanding what the particular unique challenges, obstacles, barriers, et cetera, to access are, and especially, for underserved, marginalized communities, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, women, in a lot of cases, right, LGBTQIA plus communities, folks, with disabilities, et cetera. You really have to understand what are the unique experiences, challenges, et cetera, they're facing. How are they experiencing the job search process so that you can make adjustments, right, to your hiring processes to ensure that they're more accessible to as many people as possible. That's what we're talking about here. So the more flexible you are in thinking about that, once you understand about those challenges and obstacles, the more possible, the greater the chance you'll be able to be effective in your DEI aligned recruitment processes.
Yeah.
I will add to that and say self-awareness.
Yes.
Self-awareness to me is very much the foundation. It is also sometimes a very uncomfortable exploration that needs to be had. It can sometimes, when you come into more realization of your unconscious biases, it can literally shake the core of who you felt you were. I want to say to that, just be strong. Make sure that you are in a safe place. And so much learning does happen when we are uncomfortable. As long as we remain comfortable, change doesn't happen. But allow yourself to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And so much can come out of that. That self-awareness is critical.
Thank you, Toni. you really stole my thunder on that self-awareness. It's, and I'm glad you did. It's a cultivation of a vigilant awareness that we need. I would offer something that's a more practical suggestion if you just want some help getting started. If you're a business owner, and kind of winging it on your own and thinking, well, how do I put together, DEI principles and evolve them into practice? SHRM, it's the Society for Human Resource Management. We're membership, a personal membership or a business membership will cost you $219 for a year. And it's a wealth of resources there and a wealth of individual assistance to help you build a DEI program, as well as a whole raft of other positive benefits that you get from that. But the nuts and bolts of it to help you get started on this inner work and the institutional process work is all there. I don't have a vested interest in SHRM, but it's valuable. And there are a lot of churches in our community that are getting into the moral aspects of social justice work. My church, and 10 years ago, I never thought I'd set foot in a church again, except for a wedding or a funeral. Now I'm not going to tout it by name, but it's right at the end of the church directory. As that church has opened me up to what's going on and what was going on in my life so much. And I would recommend going where you're comfortable and finding people who will help you on this path of the inside job.
That's, very powerful. Thank you for that. Thank you all. Just want to say, it has been wonderful having all of you on this conversation. I have learned a lot. This wasn't pre-recorded, folks. Like we're all learning together and hearing this for the first time. So thank you so much. It's been quite a journey today. I really, really appreciate you all being here. I will open it up for Q&A. Looks like we have about 7 minutes left. So we can ask a couple of questions. One of the questions we have is, our company is very receptive to a diverse workforce, but the industry and demographics have made that difficult. When we do hire a diverse candidate, what is the best way to make them feel welcome and part of things when no one else looks like them?
That's a loaded question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And when I say loaded, it's not an easy, it doesn't have an easy answer.
That's right.
Let me say this. We can't just wave a magic wand and boof, there's all your answers.
Right.
It takes work and it takes commitment. And one of the things we haven't really talked about much is the inclusion piece. So there's diversity and there's inclusion. The diversity to me is the visual piece. The inclusion is the environment. How welcome are people when they come into your environment, to your workplace? You cannot just work on one and not the other. It's simultaneous work. You want to bring people into an organization where they can absolutely do their best work and be successful. So you've got to work on both of those simultaneously. And it comes down to how much people are valued, how much they are accepted, how much they can be their authentic self in their workplace. Those are just some of the examples that the inclusion piece also entails. And you've got to do them both.
Absolutely. And I would just, that's such a great answer, right? And thank you, Toni, for reinforcing the point. There are no easy answers to some of these questions. There are absolutely things you can do and steps you can take, and none of it is easy necessarily, right? You should also be receptive to hearing, receiving feedback, right, from your workforce, right? And so making sure that folks feel supported, again, validated, heard that you welcome and solicit their feedback and insight as it relates to their experiences, so that you have a sense of, where you can be responsive to their needs, and to ensure that, their experiences are, not only ideal, but for success, right? And so they can thrive and do well in your organization, but also that those experiences are equitable, right? That everyone in your organization is experiencing is having equitable, if you will, experiences, right? That there's no unevenness in how folks across demographics are experiencing things. So being open to, feedback, input, and also be willing to take steps that might actually be, that you're taking in the interest of promoting DEI, but it might mean that it was a misstep, right? There was an outcome that, you didn't favor or that you didn't anticipate. Be willing to make mistakes and to address them and to own them, right? Because they will happen. This is not, easy work. It's complicated. It's messy work, right? We're talking about legacies, histories, behaviors, value systems, all these things, identities, et cetera, different experiences. So I would just say, be open to all of those things, doing all of those things and acting all those things, and updating strategies and approaches when necessary.
Yeah.
Also, just to add from my experience, be quick to admit when you're wrong and ask for forgiveness.
Yep. Because you will be. We all are at some point.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
That's just the nature of this work. Well, again, I want to, I know if everybody on the call could stand up and clap, they would. So I'm going to do it for them. Thank you all so much for this really amazing conversation. Really insightful. And I know people got a lot of value out of it, because I saw how many people stayed until the end. A lot. So I have your websites up here if any folks want to contact Dr. Carmen Phelps or Toni Bowie or Bob Clegg. And again, you're going to get these slides in an email tomorrow. So, you don't have to write super fast. They'll be on their way. And we'll also give you a recording to go back and review what we've talked about today. And just, if I could, just want to say thank you so much. This has been incredible.
Thank you so much, Jason. Thank you, Toni. Thank you, Bob.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Jason,
everyone.
Toni,
Bye,
and Carmen.
everyone.
And with the last minute here, I just want to just say that we have a June webinar coming up on June 24th at 1 p.m. What your benefits package says about your company.